Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon and happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today's research seminar will cover two white papers that evaluate race and ethnicity in health impacts from air pollution and climate change. We're joined by the PI or principal investigator, Dr. Tariq bin Marniam, who will take over after my introduction. First, I'd like to start with a few housekeeping reminders. The slide deck and recording will be posted online after the seminar. I will email everyone who is registered for the seminar once the materials and link are available. Please make sure to mute yourself when you're not speaking. You can use Zoom's chat to submit your questions and comments, or you can wait until the end of the presentation and raise your virtual hand using the React feature as shown in the image. If you're calling in, you're welcome to email your question and comments directly to me. My email is listed. It's shana.simona@arb.ca.gov. All questions will be addressed after the presentation. Here's the agenda for today's seminar. I'll start with a brief introduction and brief background and introduction. Then Dr. Benmarnia will present the research overview, followed by time for questions and comments. The specific objectives of this first white paper, Analysis of Race and Ethnicity in Social Determinants of Health and Climate Change Vulnerability, are identify the resources that provide information on climate and health impacts in relation to race and ethnicity and health co-benefit areas, including social determinants of health, which is SDH. Also conduct a scoping review to identify published scientific papers to describe the disparities and health impacts among different racial and ethnic groups in California, and to provide information on the gaps in knowledge in the literature. And the purpose of the second white paper, Health Impacts by Race and Ethnicity in Air Pollution Studies in California, is to inform CARB about the current research related to health impacts by race and ethnicity in air pollution studies with a specific focus on California and the US. Also, to summarize the current use of race and ethnicity variables in relevant studies, and to suggest recommendations for methodologies to analyze health impacts by race and ethnicity in air pollution research. Now I'd like to introduce the PI, Dr. Tariq bin Marnia. He is a member of the faculty at the University of California, San Diego, as an assistant professor in both the Department of Family Medicine and Public Health and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, CASPO, which stands for Climate, Atmospheric Sciences, and Physical Oceanography, where he shares his unique expertise in combining atmospheric, econometric, and epidemiologic modeling, as well as contributing as a lecturer in courses on environmental epidemiology, the impact of climate change on health, and advanced methods in epidemiology. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and allow Dr. Ben Marnia to share his and take over.
Thank you, Shana, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen again and get full screen. So that should be fine. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. Very happy to be here this afternoon to present you the two white papers, and that are the kind of a summary of two projects that we were conducting the last 18 months, 2 years with my group. So today there will be like two parts. So we're going to present two specific projects, two specific white papers. The first one will be focusing on the analysis of race, ethnicity, and social determinant of health, focusing on specific 8 predetermined areas that I will detail a little bit later. And we're going to present a scoping review and identify some potential areas and opportunities for future work and future research. Specifically focusing on air pollution and race ethnicity, and we'll discuss about some methodological consideration, conceptual consideration about how we can think about race ethnicity in social epidemiology in general, and specifically in the context of air pollution epidemiology. And then I will discuss a little bit about the state of the kind of conversation in social epidemiology about the use of race ethnicity and how it applies to that. And then we're going to discuss a scoping review that we did specific to race, ethnicity, air pollution, and any type of health issue in California, and then discuss about some methodological issues and recommendation. So that's really how we're going to organize a presentation today. So for each, I also wanted to give some general kind of overview to everybody today. So I also included some slides just to provide a little bit of background. So first kind of white paper is really focusing on race ethnicity in general, but focusing on 8 specific dimensions that I will detail a little bit later. And the idea was really to identify for each of these 8 dimension co-benefit areas, as we call them, is to identify, what do we know? What has been documented in the context of California? What has been found? What needs to be identified? So we made a few recommendations about what could be future area of research for each of these 8 dimensions. And we also listed a lot of resources, including data sets that could eventually be useful for future studies. And also we listed and identified studies that were conducted elsewhere outside of California that could be replicated to provide more evidence about the specific co-benefit areas. So this white paper, which you will have access to eventually, I guess. I'm not sure about the details when it will be published on a CARB website also, but has been drafted by a team, including Katie Christ, Celine Imai, Maren Hale, and myself. And the second white paper has been drafted by a different team. So that I will introduce later. So just a little bit of background, just to make sure everybody is on, so we're all on the same page. So when we talk about climate change, it's really about just like a statistics and a change in the distribution of what we call weather observations. So we really think about climate change as a change in the mean, the standard deviations, the variability, and the extremes for this statistical distribution of a specific weather observation that could be temperature, precipitation, etc. So there is a lot of evidence showing how climate-sensitive exposures, including extreme heat, for example, or wildfire and wildfire smoke, are going to impact population health through different mechanisms. In California, I would say that the 2 main climate and health issues are going to include extreme heat and air pollution, specifically air pollution coming from wildfire smoke, which is becoming the dominant source of PM 2.5 pollution in California in the last few years. And in terms of extreme heat, just to give you an order of magnitude, like every summer, actually, a study from a few years ago identified that there is more or less between 7,000 and 10,000 hospital admissions for different causes that are directly attributable to extreme heat only in California each summer, which is quite substantial. And there are so many different ways in which extreme heat can impact human health. And if you have any questions about that, I would be more than happy to answer physiologically what is going on and what we can actually do to prevent any type of heat-related health impact. In parallel, air pollution, and particularly particulate pollution and PM 2.5, is becoming a big issue, specifically when emitted from wildfires. And recent studies also found how wildfire smoke PM 2.5 are more toxic than other sources of PM 2.5, like traffic, for example. And that is becoming a main issue, a big issue in California, as wildfire smoke PM 2.5 is becoming the dominant source of PM 2.5 pollution. So just to contextualize a little bit what we're going to talk about in this specific first part. Another very important consideration when we try to understand the health impact of climate-sensitive exposure or health impact in the context of climate change is to think about the unequal distributions of this impact and to introduce this concept of social determinant of health, just to help us understanding why and to which extent these impacts attributable to climate-sensitive exposure are not going to be like random, are going to systematically impact some already vulnerable communities. So if like the concept of social determinant of health, it's really like practical to understand like the multi-level and structural determinants of these health inequities that are avoidable by definition. And it's really to think about how we can understand that and how we can act on that. That's really this kind of necessity to think about actionable intervention in relation to inequities. And I will go back to that in a second white paper about how we can better formulate epidemiological question to indicate what type of intervention we can do to reduce race ethnic inequalities, for example. So that is just to explain how when we think about climate change and health, this concept of inequality is critical. If we want to just like propose a typology about how we can think about the different ways through which climate change can be seen as a context in relation to population health and health inequalities, we can think like about these three specific mechanisms. First, climate change is going to exacerbate existing like weather determinants of health and create unprecedented situation. One good example in California is about the change in terms of the flavors of extreme heat events. So historically, in coastal California, most of the extreme heat events were daytime events driven by maximum temperature and not driven by too much humidity. This is changing. And in the next few decades, and in the context of climate change, we're expected to see more and more nighttime and humidity-driven heat waves. And that will lead to a lot of issues that we can also discuss about that. But that's one way through which climate change can be seen as a context to exacerbate public health, population health, and health inequality issues. As I mentioned, it's going to exacerbate health inequalities unless we implement adaptation strategies that take that into account and try to reduce these kind of intrinsic vulnerabilities. But it's also an opportunity for informing and helping mitigation policies that can be defined as any action to reduce emissions and concentration of greenhouse gases, to orient them in relation to how we can optimize public health benefits right away and see benefits just in the next few years, instead of expecting a few decades before we see any benefit of mitigation strategy in terms of climate change by itself. So we can think about the co-benefits coming from any mitigation strategy on the transportation sector that will have a lot of co-benefits in terms of active transportation, physical activity, air pollution on the agricultural sector, etc. So this is really a big kind of context about how we can think about the connections between climate change as a context and population health with a focus on health inequality. So in these two white papers that I will talk about today, there is a big emphasis on race ethnicity. As you know, in the US specifically, focusing and understanding race ethnicity as a social determinant is critical because of like a lot of historical practices and structural racist policies that have been implemented in the last few decades and few centuries that still have influences on different communities and may disproportionately expose and impact some communities with different race ethnic profiles. So and I will go back to that in a second white paper about what race ethnicity is about. And this is a relatively imperfect proxy for structural racism. And you will see that there are different ways to think about that. But in most of the literature in epidemiology, we use race ethnicity as an imperfect proxy to try to capture these structural racism issues or individual indiscrimination patterns. And there is a very, very extensive literature that documenting the mechanisms through which this kind of structural racism policy may impact population health. One of the most documented mechanism is through this redlining practices. That is a very relatively old policy, but still have impact. And this is just an example in San Diego, where you can see a very, very high correlation between redlined neighborhoods, like in the past century, and nowadays distribution of tree canopy and green spaces in San Diego. And you can see that this correlation may not just be due to chance, and it's not random. So this is just like one way through which we can analyze and think about that. So when we want to analyze climate change as an environmental justice issue, we can also decompose that through what we call the triple jeopardy of environmental justice. One is differential exposure, when different communities with different race ethnic composition may be differentially exposed to, or highly exposed, or more exposed to different climate sensitive exposure. The second component is going to be differential susceptibility, that even if two communities are going to be exposed to the same hazard, to the same climate sensitive exposure, the burden, the impact is going to be disproportionate in one community over the other because of the pre-existing conditions or pre-existing distribution of other social determinants of health. And finally, there is also this concept of differential adaptive capacity, that once we identify this issue and we implement interventions, we need to make sure that everybody will have an equitable access to these resources and making sure that existing policy are going to target people that need it the most. And I will show you in the next few slides a few examples for each of these three dimensions. That is just to explain how, like, the different mechanisms that we need to think about when we want to analyze climate change as an environmental justice issue. This is just like a few examples to illustrate like this specific component, but there are many studies actually that we included in a scoping review. But this is just one example of a paper from a few years ago in which we just analyzed the exposure to wildfire smoke PM2.5 in schools. And we can see that according to the race ethnicity composition among school children, there is a disproportionate exposure to wildfire smoke PM2.5 among non-Hispanic American, Indian, and Alaska Native school children. And this is the first component that I mentioned about how different communities are going to be disproportionately exposed to climate sensitive exposure. Another example is about still wildfire smoke, but in a general population. And here, this is a paper we published a few years ago showing how when we start calculating or estimating long-term exposure using different metrics to wildfire PM2.5, we see like interesting patterns in terms of differential exposure across race ethnic groups. So this is just the first component that we refer to as differential exposure. In parallel, because it's not mutually exclusive, we can also think about differential susceptibility. And that's an example from a paper from a few years ago in which we identified to which extent individuals experiencing homelessness in San Diego were disproportionately impacted by extreme heat events. So we matched individual experiencing homelessness to individuals non-experiencing homelessness with very similar socio-demographic characteristics. And we found for in the same day when there was a specific type of extreme heat event, because we compare different types of extreme heat event, we show this disproportionate impact among people experiencing homelessness, showing this or highlighting this differential susceptibility. This is just another example, but more on this in the context of these compounded climate stressors, where we can see here that this is about the cumulative or the joint effects of extreme heat and tropospheric ozone. And we can see here that there are some specific communities that will be disproportionately impacted by this synergistic effect between extreme heat and ozone. And you can see that some community characteristics, such as, for example, the proportion of individuals being non-Hispanic Black, explains this differential susceptibility. And the third component of how we can think about climate change as an environmental justice issue is about differential opportunities for adaptation or differential adaptive capacity. And here, this is just to also focus on a topic and a dimension in terms of environmental justice that is not considered enough in a climate and health literature, which is about ableism. And justice inequalities across, just like among people living with disability, different types of disability. So here, this is just, again, this is San Diego, and we just can see just like how there is a kind of high correlation or high inverse correlation between the proportion of people living with specific types of disability and access to parks, which could be a very good resource in terms of when there is an extreme heat event to try to reduce exposure to particularly high temperatures. Another example, still from San Diego, is about just like access to cooling centers. So here on the right in this map, we can see this, like the distribution of cooling centers in San Diego. And what we did for each of these cooling centers, we assessed the composition of the population that were accessing these cooling centers. And we can see in red that this is cooling center for which like communities or individuals with a high vulnerability to extreme heat were accessing, which is what we want. But you can also see that there are a lot of cooling centers in green in which people that were supposed to, or that had access to this cooling center were not considered at all as vulnerable to extreme heat. So this is just to highlight, just like some kind of partial mismatch between where adaptation opportunities are located and who can access to it. So this is also an important component to think about when we think about climate change as an environmental justice issue, is to think about how we can make adaptation strategy as equitable as possible. So that being said, that was just like a big introduction to contextualize this topic for everybody. But the first white paper was really to summarize literature on 8 pre-identified dimensions that we called health co-benefit areas that were pre-specified by CARB when we studied this white paper, that include heat impact, child health and development, economic security, food security, mobility and physical health, urban greening, wildfire and smoke impacts, and housing affordability. So what we did is we did a systematic, like a scoping review to identify what type of studies considered this specific co-benefit area in relation to race ethnicity. And we summarized what we found and we identified gaps. And we made a few recommendations about what type of research can be done in the future. So overall, across the 8 co-benefit areas, we identified 64 studies and 42 papers, because there were some papers that addressed at least 2 co-benefit areas. So this is overall just like the number of papers that we found that all specifically focus on California data. So this is just a very quick description of the paper that we found. And you can see that most of the paper we identified were focusing on heat, followed by wildfire, mobility and physical activity. And here you can see that we didn't identify any paper that actually addressed food security or economic security. So we'll go back to that later, because we didn't find anything. What we did, we tried to identify papers that address that in other settings and to articulate how that could be conducted in the context of California. Here you have some specific details for the papers that we identified. You can just see the spatial distribution. You can also see the consideration of different race ethnic group. And you can see that most of the paper were published in the last decade or last kind of decade and so. So I'm just going to quickly summarize just to make sure I can cover everything within 1 hour. But the first dimension that I want you to highlight is really about wildfire and health, specifically on smoke. So we found a few papers that actually addressed the health impact of wildfire and smoke with angle on race ethnicity. And overall, we found that many studies identified some race ethnic inequalities through the differential susceptibility mechanism. And for different types of health outcomes, including respiratory hospital admission and ED visits, emergency department visits, and also pregnancy outcomes like preterm births, for example. And most of the studies identify these inequalities, but I will go back to that later. There are a lot of gaps that we identify that I think could be good avenues for future research. In terms of extreme heat and health, this is a co-benefit area for which we found most of the studies. And same as wildfire, we identified a lot of studies that evaluated how different race ethnic groups were disproportionately impacted by extreme heat and 4 different types of health issues, mostly respiratory, cardiorespiratory, morbidity and mortality health issues, but also birth outcomes, so including preterm birth, low birth weight, small for gestational age, etc. And there was also a lot of studies coming from Southern California, focusing on different mechanistic areas, including maternal complication like gestational diabetes or preeclampsia and hypertensive disorders, and also this kind of rupture of membranes, which is one of the main mechanisms for which we may explain why extreme heat leads to preterm birth. But again, we also identified a few gaps, and I will go back to that later. In terms of mobility and physical activity, which was a different co-benefit area, we also identified a few papers that address this specific issue in relation to race ethnicity, but mostly on exposure, differential exposure in terms of opportunities for active transportation or parks, and also access to electric vehicles. And the kind of this rate at which this transition to electric vehicles is taking place across race, ethnic groups. But again, we also identified a few gaps that we listed to inform or to influence potential future research. So then, for other areas, we didn't find that much evidence. So instead of summarizing, like no evidence or very little evidence, what we did is to look at other papers, or papers connected in different contexts, to try to understand how it can be replicated or reproduced in the context of California data. And we also identified different data sources that we listed in a big table in a white paper about where this type of data set can be found. So we collected information on multiple data sources from different sources, like in relation to different socio-demographic variables, from, for example, the American Community Survey, for the Health in Places Index, for the calendar screen, for example, that just gather a lot of information for the ACS or census data, and also identified data sources for different types of health outcome. This is important to acknowledge that most of the health outcome data set require a special request, but this is not impossible. This is just takes a few extra steps. And we indicated links, and also we listed references that could be useful to understand like how this type of variables have been used or can be used. So just to go to the key recommendation for each of these dimensions. So as I said before, we generally found that for heat impacts, we found this differential, disparity in exposure and mostly susceptibility across race ethnic group. But we also identified some subgroups of the population for which evidence is still lacking in California. And we wanted to list a few areas that I think could constitute a priority for better understanding the differential impacts that extreme heat may have in California, focusing on unhoused individuals experiencing homelessness, undocumented migrants, especially in the context of occupational setting, people with existing and multiple comorbidities is something that we identified as a very important area for future research, and also people that use the durable medical equipment. And especially this is very important in some areas like in Southern California, where if we have extreme heat event and we have a power outage, that could be a very, very life-threatening condition for people that actually require electricity for specific medical equipment, like dialysis, for example. So another topic that we also wanted to emphasize, for which we didn't identify a lot of evidence in California, it's really about this link between extreme heat and substance use disorders. And that is a topic that is raising in different contexts. And I think this is something that we need more evidence to better understand these mechanisms and which subgroups of the population are particularly impacted in the context of an extreme heat event. In relation to wildfire and smoke, as I said before, we identified some consistent evidence in relation to differential susceptibility for some subgroups. And for differential exposure, we also found some consistent exposure for specific metrics, like in terms of wildfire frequency and evacuation patterns as well. But we identified two main areas for future research to better understand the long-term effect of wildfire smoke PM2.5 with different types of health issues, because as traditionally or historically, it was possible or reasonable to consider that wildfire were an exceptional and rare events. This is not something that we can consider to be accurate anymore. So now communities are repeatedly exposed to wildfire smoke events, and we will need to understand the chronic impacts of this repeated exposure. And that is something that I think would be very important. We also identified the need to think in terms of intersectional drivers, in terms of differential susceptibility. So to think about race ethnicity, but also to think about race ethnicity at the intersection of other socio-demographic characteristics and community characteristics. I will talk about that later in a second white paper, but there are a lot of different methods and approaches that have been advanced in the past few years that I think could be quite useful to address these intersectionality issues in environmental justice. For mobility and physical activity, we identified as a future, in terms of gaps, that we really need more data on just the impact of climate sensitive exposure on physical activity and different mobility behaviors, including biking and also traffic collisions and this type of outcomes. This is something for which we don't have a lot of evidence in California as opposed to other states in the US. And for urban greening, we also identify that more research, while we found some evidence for some of the, some specific outcomes, like birth outcomes, academic performance, there is still a lot of uncertainty about some health outcomes, like different greening indicators, because focusing on tree canopy or NDVI is a start, but it's everything but perfect because there's so many so much heterogeneity in terms of what a green space can represent, can do, and how it can benefit to different types of health issues through like extreme heat, through air pollution, etc. So there is a lot of research to do that. And also like identifying and optimize how we can green and how urban intervention can optimize or prioritize specific areas in terms of greening will also be important to do in the future. And for the other domains for which we didn't find any or that not too much evidence, we also highlighted a few areas for future research. And I won't go through each of these specific recommendations, but we really wanted to highlight what could be done. And we also linked this recommendation to other studies conducted in other geographical contexts. So it will be easier for people that would like to conduct these studies to be inspired. So for this first white paper, in conclusion, we found a lot of heterogeneity across the 8 co-benefit areas that were pre-identified. Of course, for extreme heat and wildfire, there was a lot of evidence indicating evidence for differential exposure and differential susceptibility towards across race ethnic groups. But for the other dimensions, there is still a lot of work to do. So hopefully, with the recommendations and the resources that we listed in terms of data sets and methods and examples from other settings will be helpful to help future researchers to actually fill these gaps. So that was what I wanted to talk about for this first white paper. So now we'll talk about the second white paper. So if that's okay with everybody, we're just going to keep the questions for the end. So hopefully you can write them down also, and we'll have a lot of time at the end to discuss. So this second white paper was slightly different, more focused, because it's really about air pollution and race ethnicity, with very trying to understand the conceptual and methodological consideration in this literature to understand what is being done, what are the different conceptual ways which we can think about the links between race ethnicity, air pollution, and human health, and what has been done in California and what needs to be improved. What are the specific recommendations focusing on methodological recommendations? So the writing team for this specific white paper, including Arnab, Day, Chen Chen, Shirley Zhu, Rod Gonzalez, and myself. So that is really the overall objective of this white paper, to synthesize as systematically as possible the literature about race, ethnicity, air pollution, and any health issues in California, and to identify what can be done and what can be improved in future literature. So first of all, I will give you again a little bit of background. But first of all, just we identified 4 different settings through which we can think about race, ethnicity, air pollution, with or without health issues. First, we can think about social variables, including race, ethnicity, as a main exposure of interest. And you will see in the next few slides that leads to a lot of issues or questions or things to consider in terms of causal inference. I will go back to that. But that will be the main setting where we think about individual race, ethnicity as the main exposure of interest, and we have a health outcome. So we would like, for example, to document the probability of having asthma exacerbation event, for example, in relation to individual race ethnicity. And that will be a way to quantify the amplitude of health inequalities, for example. The second setting will be when we have environmental exposure, say a wildfire smoke PM2.5, and we try to understand the impact of wildfire smoke PM2.5 on asthma rates. Whatever the design, it can be ecological, it can be individual, it doesn't matter. And here we'll be interested by an effect measure modification question. So the question will be, if we identify an effect of wildfire smoke PM2.5 on asthma, does or is this effect modified by another variable that in this context will be individual or contextual race ethnicity? So can we identify or can we highlight that everything else being equal, the same exposure to wildfire smoke PM2.5 will have a differential, disproportionate impact in one race ethnic group over another one. So this is really how we quantify differential susceptibility, to think about race ethnicity as an effect modifier. Okay, so that's the second mechanism. Third, it's really about a mediation setting. where here we will have like a social variable like race ethnicity. We'll have a health outcome of interest, but here we're going to add air pollution as a mediator, because we can think about the total effect between a race ethnicity variable and Y, a given health outcome, as a total amplitude, the total inequality, the total race ethnic inequality. And one question of interest will be, what is a specific contribution of air pollution to this inequality? Said differently, this is also a way to quantify to which extent intervening on air pollution may be a good way to reduce race ethnic inequality for a given health outcome of interest. So this third setting that we call mediation setting is also very emerging and I think very important, one that could inform policies and adaptation strategies that could help like inform how we can reduce race ethnic inequalities. And I will talk about that later. And finally, another setting that we're not going to cover in this review because this is not that relevant, and also there's just like a million of papers like that, where we can think about social variables just as confounders, where we will have a specific exposure of interest, like it can be air pollution, it can be physical activity, it can be diet, whatever. And we're going to have a health outcome of interest. And then we're going to identify race ethnicity as a confounder, as a proxy of multiple structural reasons, and we're going to condition, adjust, for example, on that variable. So that is the four settings that we wanted to highlight, but we don't cover this specific component in this review. So from now, I'm just going to focus on these three different dimensions, these three different settings. Social variables as a main exposure, social variables as effect modifiers, effect measure modifiers, because as we will discuss later, the scale of effect modification is very important, and social variables in a context of mediation setting. So just to give you, before I get into the results of the scoping review, I just wanted to give you an overview of just like the literature and how in social epidemiology we think about race ethnicity nowadays. So there are a lot of perspectives, and I wanted to highlight a few papers that if you're interested by this topic, I highly encourage you to read. So first, these three papers are about race ethnicity and social epidemiology in general. And these papers that I wrote a few years ago was really to summarize this discussion in a context of environmental health specifically. And most of the examples I took were about air pollution. So that is quite relevant for this white paper. But when we think about race ethnicity as an exposure, it leads to a lot of causal or identification assumption question or issues in terms of causal inference. So just a quick summary of how we think about causal inference in epidemiology nowadays is really through a specific framework that we call the potential outcome framework, or the counterfactual framework, that comes with three different identification assumptions: exchangeability, that I'm not going to talk about, which is really about sources of biases, including confounding, selection, and misclassification. But there's also at least two other identification assumptions related to consistency and positivity. And also there is a lot of literature in causal inference about the necessity of having an exposure that is manipulable. And you will see that this is a very, very important and critical topic when we think about race ethnicity, because except a few very, very specific settings, we can think about a way to manipulate race ethnicity, and that's a source of issue. Just to illustrate how race ethnicity is particularly special when we think about causal inference, I would like to give a few examples. So first, let's talk about positivity. So the formal definition of what positivity means in a context of causal inference is that the probability of being exposed, if we think about the binary exposure, we expose or we're not exposed to air pollution, for example, the probability of being exposed has to be unequal to or different from 0 or 1 as a function of covariates of interest identified as confounders. So differently, it means that if we have air pollution binary, yes, no, and we have race ethnicity as a confounder, it means that we don't have to have a perfect correlation between race ethnicity and air pollution, meaning that, for example, if you have non-Hispanic Black versus non-Hispanic White, if non-Hispanic Black are all exposed to air pollution, and which means that non-Hispanic Black are exclusively not exposed to air pollution, we have a positivity violation because we have a perfect correlation. So then it will be impossible to disentangle the effect of air pollution from the effect of this specific confounder, in this context, race ethnicity. And in social epidemiology, this is a very, very common problem. And that's not by chance, this is not random. I wanted to highlight this very, very nice paper that illustrates that in the context of racial segregation and preterm births in North Carolina. And here, they wanted to assess the role of a neighborhood deprivation index, which is a composite index at the neighborhood level, in relation to pretense. And they decompose that by the composition for each neighborhood in terms of non-Hispanic Black individuals. And here you can see that in this specific setting, in this specific Durham County, they didn't identify any neighborhood with a low deprivation index that had a high proportion of non-Hispanic Black. And similarly, in a different county, they didn't find any neighborhood with a high deprivation index with a low proportion of non-Hispanic Black. And that is not random. This is just due to many, many reasons. But that will be a big issue when we're going to try to make, to infer causal effect from a specific exposure on a given health outcome, because it would be absolutely impossible to disentangle the effects of the exposure of interest from a specific conduct because of the violation of this positivity issue. And this issue is extremely common in social epidemiology and in environmental justice issue. And that's why I wanted to highlight that, because it's a very important problem. So in terms of consistency, consistency is another identification assumption, which can be defined as the way through which a change in exposure or like a change in the contrast of a given exposure of interest, so which is going to influence a health outcome of interest, is supposed to be the same or supposed to be consistent. If we have an exposure or change in exposure that may lead to a change in the outcome through different pathways, through different mechanisms, that will be a violation of the consistency assumption. One example is about education from this paper by Rakoff and colleague, showing how education, individual education, for example, as an exposure is not consistent. Because if we want to think about how an increase, a change in education is going to lead to a better health situation, there are so many pathways, so many mechanisms which it can happen in terms of income increase, social networks, in terms of knowledge, etc. So all of these mechanisms may matter, but the fact that we can't disentangle that can be a problem, and this is what we refer to as a consistency assumption. And when we think about race ethnicity, that is a typical problem. So, and finally, something that is extremely important and specific to race ethnicity, but not only, there is a lot of literature discussing this issue in relation to gender variables and gender issues, but today, the main focus is on race ethnicity. So as I mentioned before, the use and the reference to race ethnicity and self-reported race ethnicity in social sciences and then in epidemiology has grown substantially since the 70s in the US specifically. And when we think about what it means, it's very ambiguous because this is self-reported race ethnicity, and it's supposed to approximate like structural racism patterns, also individual discrimination. And this ambiguity can be problematic, and we'll talk about that later. There are a few exceptions to this ambiguity. It's really when it is actually possible to manipulate race ethnicity in a specific experiment. So I identified at least two examples. The first one is about job application. This is a very well-documented area where, for example, you're going to send CVs to job application, and you're going to keep exactly the same CV, and you're just going to manipulate to change the race ethnicity on the CV. You keep exactly the same CV, you apply to the same job, and you see what happens. And then this literature systematically identified that when you just change race ethnicity on the CV for the same job application, the probability of being invited for an interview is not at all the same, is way lower. And that, I think, is a good way to actually approximate discrimination in terms of job opportunities, because you can actually manipulate that. Another example is about in medicine, where they did the same in terms of specific medical files and asked physicians to provide specific diagnosis and treatment. And they identify the same differential diagnosis and treatment according to reported or manipulated race ethnicity. So besides these two examples, it's very difficult to think about a way through which we can think about manipulating race ethnicity. So that's why we need to think differently about this race ethnicity as an exposure. So when we look, and that's a very, very extensive literature in social epidemiology about how we can think about race ethnicity in general, there are, in summary, three main perspectives. So there is a perspective that we can call conservative, which says that all exposures in epidemiology must be manipulable. And there is this kind of saying about no causation without manipulation. And in this perspective, they basically say we should just not use race ethnicity as an exposure. It doesn't make any sense. We should just stop doing that. Same for gender and same for other social variables. There is a different perspective, which is kind of, other kind of side of the spectrum, which is actually race ethnic variables can be used as exposure. Even if we don't think about manipulation, it's not a big deal. We just need to make additional assumption about how we're going to interpret the coefficient we get from these models, and we will be fine. And there are one of the papers I showed before is very interesting in this regard by Van der Wiel and Robinson. This one in which they propose a strong and weak ways to interpret race ethnic inequalities when you put race ethnicity as a main exposure of interest. Oops. And finally, there is another kind of compromising perspective in which you can also just switch the causal problem and still have race ethnicity as your main exposure of interest, but you're going to set up a mediation analysis where all of your manipulability criteria will be focused on a mediator. And there, in this setting, you have race ethnicity as an exposure, a given health outcome, and a manipulable variable as a mediator. That could be air pollution, for example. And the idea here is going to switch the causal question to what happens when you manipulate the mediator of interest to the total effect, which is the amplitude of inequalities. So this is a way to compromise. So you still quantify inequalities, you still use race ethnicity, but all of your manipulability criteria and identification assumptions such as positivity, consistency, and exchangeability are also focused on a mediator of interest. And that can be seen as a good solution for that. And this is why I wanted to emphasize the type of literature, the type of studies that I highlighted before based on mediation analysis, because it's to me a promising area for future research to not only identify inequalities in relation to air pollution, but also what will be the benefit of intervening on air pollution to reduce race ethnic inequalities, which I think is a very important mission. So that being said, that was just maybe 10 minutes, a way to summarize a little bit what is happening in this literature. And you can see that this is very, very recent literature. It's a very active area of research. And I think it applies very well to the context of environmental justice study, specifically in the context of air pollution. So then what we wanted to do in this white paper is to conduct a scoping review to identify, following this typology that I highlighted before, all of the studies that have been conducted in California. And we classified the studies, we identified, we summarized what they found, the study design, the type of air pollutants, the type of health outcomes, etc. And then we identify for each of these three different dimensions, race ethnicity as an exposure, race ethnicity as an effect modifier, and race ethnicity in a mediation setting, key recommendation for future studies, including and specifically methodological recommendations. So very briefly about the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you can see, and you will have all of these details accessible on a white paper if you want to go through that. But we really had criteria about just the language, but also that the fact that the paper will be peer reviewed, the date of publication, focusing on California, specific criteria about air pollution to focus on outdoor and ambient air pollution, and obviously specific criteria about race ethnicity. And we also had exclusion criteria, including, for example, we excluded all studies that only focus on race ethnicity as a confounder, and same for air pollution. So anyway, and we also excluded all of the indoor air pollution studies. This is a quick summary, a flowchart of the different steps of the scoping review. And you can see that we started from more or less 4,000 papers, and we ended up with 134 studies that we actually kept for data extraction. So here, this is like a very detailed summary of what we found. So here on the left, the first message, you can see that most of the studies we identified were published very recently between 2021 and 2024. Here you can see the decomposition of the study by study period according to exposure disparity, which is SES or race ethnicity as an exposure of interest, the effect modification analysis, and the mediation analysis. So you can see that the vast majority of studies were either effect modification or exposure disparity studies, and very, very few studies were actually focusing on a mediation analysis. Here, This is among all of the studies, and that we decompose by the type of studies. You can see to which extent the focus on single pollutants and multiple pollutants. And you can see that most of the focus on a single pollutant, mostly PM2.5 or NO2 or tropospheric ozone. Here, this is other characteristics that we extracted from each study in terms of where data was coming from, what type of health issues they used, how they collected race ethnicity information, etc. One sub-objective of this scoping review was also to focus to identify the specific role of income across these studies, just to specifically understand how race, ethnicity, income are linked in the context of air pollution and health. So we wanted to do this specific sub-investigation, and we identified to which extent they included or not income in the studies. So the majority of studies actually included it for all types of studies. And here we can see the types of income data that have been used, the level of aggregation, whether it was individual, household, or more community level, and to which extent they consider the intersectionality between race, ethnicity, and income, to which extent the role of race ethnicity may be heterogeneous according to the income level, and vice versa, and to which extent they found or discussed findings in relation to income. So, in general, in terms of the main methodological issues that we identified from this literature, is that most of the study actually discussed finding in relation to race ethnicity. So the majority of studies, however, did not actually use a conceptual framework to discuss about what they actually mean by race ethnicity and how they operationalize what conceptual frameworks they use to think about the reason for which we may see these disparities in terms of exposure or differential susceptibility. Most of the study didn't discuss that. They just included race ethnicity and without providing too much explanation about what was a hypothesis and what was the mechanisms which they may explain whatever results they found. In terms of effect modification, there was also a lot of analytical issues that we identified. For example, 31%, which is almost 1/3 of studies that aimed at identifying to which extent race ethnicity modify the relationship between a given air pollutant and a given health outcome, didn't conduct a formal heterogeneity test, which makes impossible to conclude about whether or not there is effect modification, because we really need to formally test. Stratifying is a first step, but it's not enough. We really need to couple this stratification analysis with a heterogeneity test, just to make sure that the two distribution of effect estimates are distinguishable. And also, we wanted to note that most of the literature focused on effect modification on the multiplicative scale, which, when we think about how we can use this information, can be problematic, because most of the time, whether it's implicit or explicit, the scale that we care about in public health for effect modification is the additive scale. When we try to identify which subgroups of the population are more vulnerable because we want to optimize a specific program, for example, we want to identify either with the area or subgroup of the population for which it will be even more beneficial to reduce exposure to air pollution. What we're thinking about is really about additive effect modification. It's really about how many cases attributable to air pollution can we save in this specific community, in this specific subgroup versus others. So this is really about just like the importance of thinking in terms of additive effect modification. And most of the study didn't do that. Instead, they focused on a multiplicative scale, because most of the statistical models that we use in air pollution epidemiology are based on a multiplicative scale. It could be a logistic regression, it could be a Cox model, it can be a Poisson regression, negative binomial, etc. So all of these models are going to be on a multiplicative scale by default. And we also identified another issue, which is what we refer to in epidemiology as a table 2 fallacy, where they interpreted coefficient besides the coefficients that were of interest, like the air pollution or race ethnicity, for example. And that is another very well-documented problem. Specifically to race ethnicity in a context of mediation analysis. As I said before, this is very emerging. So only 6 studies that we found were focusing on that. And we identified several areas of improvement, just including clearly stating a causal framework for this type of analysis, which can be quite difficult, but this is possible. And nowadays, a lot of resources and tutorials available to properly conduct this specific type of analysis, and also discuss and verify the identification assumption behind this type of mediation analysis. Very, very few studies did that. And also the importance of considering interaction between a mediator and the exposure of interest, which at the end of the day is critical for this environmental justice study because it will refer to the component of differential susceptibility. Because when we think about race ethnicity as an exposure, a given air pollutant like PM2.5, for example, as a mediator, and a given health outcome, say asthma rates, we can think about two mechanisms, like we can have race ethnicity inequalities in asthma rate attributable to air pollution because of a differential exposure, because some race ethnic group are going to be more exposed to PM2.5, for example. But we can also think about another mechanism, which is differential susceptibility, because of the pre-existing distribution in terms of, I don't know, comorbidities, housing characteristic, occupational characteristic, access to healthcare, etc. The same level of PM2.5 may have a differential impact in a specific race ethnic group. And we really want to understand these two components and including an interaction between, or the potential interaction between a mediator and the exposure can be very, very beneficial for that. And none of the studies, unfortunately, did that. And then are many more advanced technical aspects that also we identified in terms of how to actually properly handle multiple and correlated mediators, which is a tricky and difficult thing to do. But again, there are many, many resources, and we listed many resources and tutorials to actually do that correctly, and examples as well. So in summary, we also had this table in which for each of the type of question, we identified specific recommendation in terms of what we think could be very interesting to do in the future in this specific field of race, ethnicity, air pollution, and health. For air pollution estimation, I think it will be important to move, like conduct more and more studies to switch from a static way to think about air pollution exposure at the place of residence to a more dynamic way to take into consideration activity space, because people don't spend 100% of the time at home, and taking into consideration where they work, where they go to school, etc., is critical, and that's very important. We also identify some kind of technical aspect about how to actually deal with administrative unit and spatial unit of analysis. And we identified and we listed a few papers that discussed why it may matter and some recommendation about how to do that. Also, an important recommendation is to explore spatial heterogeneity in this dose response in the relationship between air pollution and health across race ethnic groups, because most of the studies had one estimate for the entire state. As you know, there is so much heterogeneity in California that I think having some flexibility and heterogeneity of a space could be useful to identify where actually these type of issues or inequalities in relation to air pollution between race, ethnicity, and a given health outcome, for example, can be problematic. The second type of consideration is about how to operationalize and conceptually think about race ethnicity. So we listed a few recommendations, including to actually use more modern and newly developed metrics to actually capture structural racism across different domains. And there is a very active literature in social epidemiology about it's time to switch or to move away from using this imperfect proxy of racism, which is individual self-reported race ethnicity. We use that, and we've been using that in epidemiology for the last decades because it's just available. It's available in multiple forms. This is the same as zip code. Zip code in epidemiology doesn't necessarily represent how a community is organized. So we use it so much just because it's available everywhere. But that's mostly useful for USPS, not for epidemiologists. But we use it because it's available. So the same applies to self-reported race ethnicity. And now there are more and more scholars that recommend to use different metrics for structural racism, and we listed multiple references to actually guide future researchers that would like to test and analyze these different domains of structural racism. In the same vein, focusing on a concept of intersectionality is something that has been recommended by many scholars, and I think it's very important. And we provided a lot of resources and recommendations about methods to actually do that. One of these methods is based on recent development in machine learning literature, where we can use algorithms such as generalized random forest for example, or BART or the algorithm that could be extremely useful to think about this high dimensional effect modification problem and really think in terms of intersectionality, not just about race ethnicity by itself and then income and then education and then gender, etc., but really think in an intersectional way. And nowadays, a lot of tools that are available that I think would be useful for that. On this topic, a few months ago, we just published a tutorial in which we explain, just like the kind of mathematical intuition behind these methods and how they could be useful for this type of intersectionality question, and that could be applied to air pollution epidemiology. Same about exposure disparity studies. Specific methodological recommendation about effect modification. So we spent enough time on that. So, but just we systematically and comprehensively listed specific recommendation. And same about mediation analysis, where we really just encouraged more studies, but with specific methods that would be as robust as possible and to clearly define and check identification assumption. So in conclusion, for this specific second white paper, okay, and I will be right on time, we really wanted to synthesize what we know and how we can think about the links between air pollution, race, ethnicity, and health in general in California. So we conducted this scoping review from 2000 to 2023, and we clearly and systematically documented and summarized this literature across these three dimensions: race, ethnicity as an exposure, as an effect modifier, and in the context of mediation analysis. And we, as I mentioned, identified specific recommendation and area for future research with specific resources about how to actually do that. So the goal of this specific white paper was really to guide future research to really help accelerate how we can take into consideration these inequality issues in air pollution regulation to actually accelerate the closure of this race ethnic inequality gap through air pollution interventions. So that's really what was the goal of this scoping review. And so in general, just a few words to wrap everything up. These two white papers were different. The second one way more specific and way more technical and detailed. The first one was more like big picture, focusing on 8 dimensions that were predefined. But at the end of the day, these two white papers really highlight what we know and what we need to know. So hopefully it will be useful for different agencies like CARB and others to orient and think what can be useful in terms of epidemiological or empirical evidence to guide future policy and adaptation strategy in the context of climate change with this kind of race, ethnic inequality and equity focus in mind, which I hope I convinced you is critical. So I also wanted to thank all of the people that contributed to these two white papers, Chen, Arnab, Maren, Katie, Raoul, Saile, and Shirley. So this is just like a group effort, and I hope it was comprehensive and clear enough. So now we have plenty of time for the question, and I stick to more or less 1 hour. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benmarnia. And just a reminder to everyone, I will email everyone who registered for this seminar once the CARB webpage is updated with the final reports and recording to this seminar. Now, if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, or also you can drop it in the chat. We have some time. Barbara, go ahead.
Hi, I just wonder for this audience if you could talk a little bit about the other metrics used to study racism. I mean, I know that people have in the past looked at things like poverty levels and that just doesn't seem to be something that really fits because it's not a poverty issue, it's a racism issue. And so I wonder if you could talk about some of the other methods besides race that have been used in that context.
Absolutely. Actually, I will just share another slide. Is that okay? So that would be
sure.
Let me put it a little bit bigger. So hopefully you can see the slide. So this is, again, that's like these two references that I highly recommend, first of all. This one by a very good colleague of mine, Cindy Bailey, that explains this kind of literature and was a very important paper a few years ago. And this one by Atkins and Jackson that actually describe what metrics could be used to capture structural racism. And the way we can think about it is to across domains. So we can think about the mechanisms which structural racism may operate in terms of air pollution. For example, is through political representation to criminal and legal system in terms of like that will lead to a lot of housing and mental health issues, economic opportunity and job opportunities, and also housing practices. So that would be usually the domains that we think about. So for example, in terms of housing, we can also think about just like the different types of housing characteristics that will more or less increase penetration of odor pollution to indoor. And that's a specific actionable way through which we can think about how inequalities towards air pollution may operate. Something about political representation in terms of how you're going to be able to how to say that advocate towards your representatives. That is something that could be useful and important. For example, to argue that you need a clean air center, for example, you need a cooling center in a specific neighborhood. This type of political representation metric matters a lot for this type of adaptation strategies. So this is what is the kind of what is recommended in this literature, to really use variables that are kind of operationalized, like possible to operationalize in terms of actions and in terms of prioritization. Instead of just using race ethnicity or composition in terms of race ethnicity, or using indexes like neighborhood deprivation index or poverty level, these kind of composite indexes can be useful to summarize a lot of information. But when it's time to actually recommend specific practical actions, it's a little bit harder. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
And yes, I will definitely, the slides will be shared.
Erica, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. This was very interesting. I really found it interesting. I think it was in the first part of the presentation when you discussed about ableism and accessibility. So I was wondering, because I know you said that we should kind of consider those factors when we come up with prevention, I guess, methods for heat-related health outcomes. Do you know of any maybe examples where it's been, I guess, successfully designed with green spaces with maybe more accessibility in mind to combat that?
Yep. Yes, I are going to, I will try to do that at the same time to put on the chat one or two references that actually discuss this successful story. But yes, it's really, but the first step is really to document and highlight the fact that when you design a green space, even if you have very good intentions to reduce micro-Italians, to have more like social net interactions, more physical activity, you're really thinking about accessibility is critical. And also not only accessibility for just like a physical disability per se, but also diversity, because there is a lot of disability across just like neurological disorders that I think are also very important to consider. And this is really what I wanted to emphasize, that when you think about adaptation, you need to be as inclusive as possible and also think about this concentration. And so I'm not very good at doing two things at the same time, but I will share this reference, which I think is a good way to discuss about that by Kosanik and colleague. And yeah, this one is a good resource too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
No problem. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question.
Asia, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for both of these white paper presentations. At the end of your last section of presentation, you were talking about intersectional analyses and trying to understand multiple variables, including things like housing condition and gender and race, all of that together. And I'm wondering how you differentiate that from vulnerability indices, which compile those. Is that a different thing, or how do you see those as being related?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question, because so maybe just to make sure everybody on the same page, I can just quickly describe how these indexes are calculated, estimated, and how that actually differs from using this type of intersectionality methods. So first of all, there are a lot of indexes that have been proposed, coming like traditionally they're coming from like the UK. There was this like the Townsend index has been proposed to capture a lot of domains, including income, education, etc., occupational status. And the idea is to have just like multiple indicators and to use what like a statistical tool that we call a principal component analysis that will just summarize like specific like information about multiple variables and use this information to build an index, a composite index. So at the end of the day, we'll have one index that we usually go from -3 to 3. This is the way it's calculated. And when we can use quantiles to synthesize that, and that will give us information about the overall kind of deprivation of vulnerability. And different, like the CDC vulnerability index or the EJ index when it was still operational a few months ago in the US, were based on the same idea to try to capture multiple SES, socioeconomical status dimensions at the neighborhood level also. But so that can be very useful just as a place just to identify overall what is going on. However, there is a lot of ambiguity with these indexes because we have an index which by definition doesn't tell us what is the specific metric, what is contributing. And that's really an index by itself. So for example, we can have two neighborhoods with the exact same value for the index, but this same value can come from very different reasons. One neighborhood can have a high value for the index because of high level of poverty, but another neighborhood can have the exact same value for the index, but just because there is a lot of, I don't know, very low education. I don't know, even if this is usually correlated, but this is just to say that these indexes, while useful to synthesize a lot of information, at the end of the day, when we really want to know what can we do and how we can prioritize, it can be a little bit ambiguous. But it's true that if we use these vulnerability indexes as an effect modifier, so we say we want to understand the relationship between extreme heat and I don't know, like respiratory or kidney failure, for example, and we want to identify like how to prioritize resources. We can use a vulnerability index or deprivation index also to see, okay, this is like if we identify that some areas with a high index are particularly vulnerable, that could be a useful way to prioritize target specific areas, but we won't know why. In parallel, these approaches that I mentioned will allow us to know why, because we will have the same question: what is the relationship between extreme heat and I forgot what I said, a kidney failure, for example. But instead of using just a vulnerability index that will itself include a lot of information, we're going to include all of these individual variables as effect modifier, like income, education, race, ethnicity, etc., and their potential interaction, which refers to this concept of intersectionality. And then we'll be able to understand, okay, so communities with a high level of I don't know, like people with Medicaid, and also had a high proportion of non-Hispanic Black individuals, et cetera, are particularly vulnerable to this heat and kidney failure issue. And that's, so at the end of the day, we may end up with the same information, but we have more information about the why and what specific components and characteristics modulate these risks. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how we can summarize the differences. That makes sense, Deidre?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
And then there was a question I got emailed to me. It says, can the control of stationary, mobile, and area source air contaminant emissions compensate or overcome the long-term negative impact of discriminatory land use patterns and practices that disproportionately impact populations of color with lower incomes and less education?
I would say compensate, yes. Overcome, probably not, because it's hard to catch up on decades, if not centuries, of inequalities. But that's exactly the goal. To me, this is why these two white papers are important, is because it's just one of, first of all, we can think about air pollution regulation in a different way, and we can have different ways to prioritize that. But if we articulate that reducing health inequalities across race, by race, ethnicity, or the structural reasons like that is important, then that could be just a priority. That could become a priority, and we can have the same level of resources, but instead prioritize them towards reducing inequality in terms of improving population health. And that would be two different things. So doing this type of prioritization, I think will help compensate for this long-lasting drivers of inequalities. This is, it's like if we start in the world with a lot of very long-lasting inequalities, and the goal is how can we catch up? How can we get to the ideal situation as fast as possible? We probably won't see a world with perfect inequality, all of us, during our lifetime. But if we can identify how we can accelerate the rate, I think that would be a good goal.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? We're scheduled till 4, but so if anyone has any more questions, feel free to ask.
Plenty of time.
Sonia, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm not a social scientist, so this was all a little bit hard for me to follow, but I'm wondering if there is like a takeaway for CARB specifically that you think we should focus on for future research or future policy making in this area. What would be your like biggest recommendation for us?
Oh, it's a big picture. Really, the one takeaway is we can prioritize air pollution policies and regulation towards reducing inequalities. And there are like specific things to like consideration to have in terms of study design, in terms of analytical strategy, and what to be pay attention to. So this is what we listed. So in summary, yes, we can, and we did our best to indicate how to actually do that in the best way possible. But it's really about showing how this is possible to think about air pollution regulation in an equitable way. Because we can also decide that reducing inequality is not a priority. Instead, this is really population. We really want to reduce the burden of air pollution as a population, which is fine, but this is a different priority. If we want, and this is also possible to mix up, to have to diversify the type of strategy. But if there is a political motivation to focus on this equitable strategy or air pollution regulation oriented towards equity, it's possible. And this is how we can do it, or to get to generate evidence that will help like the implementation of this strategy. This is like in a nutshell what this especially the second white paper is about, because it's really on air pollution.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Deidre.
Yeah, this isn't for you. This might just be for CARB folks to think about. I think also with all of the attention on issues of equity, that framing of like, do we want this to be a political choice about equity? You can also flip that framing and say, do we want this to be a political choice about inequality, right? So if we're not planning or working towards equity, we're maintaining the status quo, which all of the research says is inequitable. And so I just want to throw that out there because I think we're consistently running into this kind of framing of like, this is a political choice and it's a choice towards equity, and we want to shy away from that maybe. And so I just want to flip it to and just remind folks like that status quo is deeply inequitable.
I could not agree more. Not the status quo is a choice, and totally agree.
Maybe I just give it one more minute if anyone has last minute questions, comments.
No problem. But it's just like to while people are, yeah, of course, my email is fine. I think I provided my email at the end of the slides. But in general, just the two white papers are different in nature, and also they don't target necessarily the same communities. The second one is really for researchers, like social and environmental epidemiologists, that do this type of research or are interested to switch toward this research. And this is really about what do we know and how we can actually do the next research as best as possible. So the target audience is really for researchers that will generate evidence that then CARB and other agencies can be using. So that's really what this second paper is about. The first one is a higher, I think it's more about identifying priorities for funding opportunities. It's really about, there is a lot of evidence that could be important that have been identified as priorities. And there are lots that we just don't know. There is a lot we know, especially about extreme heat and wildfire. But there is a lot that we just don't know. So we can't even start thinking about prioritization or what to do if we just don't have any empirical evidence, first of all. So the first white paper is really about just like a roadmap for how we can just like what will be the gaps to fill in the next few years. And eventually, that will be the next step will be to identify how to do this research, and then how this empirical evidence can be useful for actually guiding policy. So the two white papers are very different in their nature and their scope.
Sonia, go ahead.
Yeah, can you just quickly clarify which one has like the research gaps recommendations that we can pay attention to?
So the first white paper is research gap for the topics in general. So that will be the first one. For example, we indicated if you want, like for housing insecurity, this is okay. There is nothing. We don't know anything about housing insecurity, race, ethnicity, and health in California. There is nothing. So what we identified data resources that could be useful to capture to how we can there are different scales for housing insecurity that we listed from other papers. So if just like to guide these future research, this is like what we did. The second white paper is really for just like for scientists that already work in this area, just to do a better job at gathering empirical evidence.
Yeah, and maybe a follow-up to that is, we get a lot of comments from the public saying, hey, you have enough evidence, just take action. Why do you need to do more research? So do you think that some of the research gaps you identify kind of fall outside of that category? Like, we can't even take action without doing this research first.
Yeah, I agree with, I think for some components, I think there is enough evidence to do action, and there are actions. It's not like if nothing was done. So I think that's kind of a fair comment. But I think but on the other hand, just to take one example about for which we need to do something, but we just don't know, is about wildfire smoke. Wildfire smoke is a big issue, but it's a very unprecedented issue. Because we just don't know at all what is happening when people are repeatedly exposed to wildfire smoke. What is a regime? For example, is it worse to be exposed to one wildfire smoke event a year? Or is it just like very, very briefly and then nothing? Or is it just like worse to have two wildfire smoke events just like back to back? What is worse in terms of chronic diseases, in terms of dementia, etc.? That we just don't know. So if we want to then articulate warning systems or actions that reduce exposure of specific communities to wildfire smoke PM2.5, for example, as a secondary prevention. Because obviously, if we can reduce wildfire smoke to take place in the first place, that is even better. But assuming we can't do that fully, how can we do, and how can we prioritize, and what type of action can we do to prevent this kind of chronic diseases that are going to increase in the context of this wildfire smoke? That is something for which we have no evidence. So I don't even know what I would recommend to do, because we just don't know what's going on. So for that specifically, I think we don't know what to do. A second example for which we just don't know is about compounded climate stressors in general. That's another contract we're working on with colleagues at UCLA. This is a very emerging and new problem we have to deal with in public health. The fact that we can think about extreme heat as its own problem, and then wildfire its own problem, etc. They are happening more and more at the same time, at the same place, and we need to think about how can we actually integrate extreme heat prevention and wildfire smoke prevention and air pollution prevention and urban landscape and urban planning. How can we better integrate? That is something for which I think there is still some work to be done on this kind of compounded framework. But besides that, I think we have a lot of evidence about the negative impact of multiple regulated air pollutants. And I think there is a lot of evidence and same for wildfire smoke. In a short-term way, I think the evidence is absolutely unambiguous about how when there is a smoke event, respiratory hospital admission are just going to explode. So that, I think, is enough to justify actions in terms of warning system when there is a smoke event or smoke, like with smoke warning systems. I think is fine. But this is really to switch to this compounded and long-term pattern that I think we just don't know what to do yet. Does it answer your question, Sonia?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
To piggyback on her question, how about the other gap areas like the economic and food security and housing affordability? What other research, since we haven't seen any, at least that fits your criteria, what what are some future recommendations that we could think about to fill this gap?
So there is egg and chicken thing, because so food and economic insecurity and housing insecurity are dimensions that have been identified a priori when we studied this white paper. They're important because they're important mechanisms through which inequalities may operate. So for food, economic, and housing insecurity, food and economic, housing is a bit different. Food and economic insecurity, there is a lot of research. That's a way just to identify, for example, how for example, an elevated or extreme heat event may disproportionately impact some communities, some individuals over others, just to better understand, is it attributable somehow to some kind of economic patterns or some kind of food insecurity pattern in terms of food diversity, food access, etc. And is it relation to the housing characteristics? So we have no evidence about that in California right now. And so the idea was, we provided those scales. Instead of reinventing the wheel, there are existing scales that have been validated to actually quantify the level, amplitude of food insecurity. We can combine that with existing environmental EP studies to try to understand these connections. And for housing insecurity, this is more multidimensional. And actually, I'm aware of multiple projects, especially in the Bay Area, that really try to understand this kind of penetration rates and try to understand the drivers of this kind of outdoor-indoor penetration rate and why is that. So I think this is also important. So, yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned, identifying in the literature the table 2 fallacy. This, misinterpretation of coefficients in regression models, particularly when estimating effect modification. And I'm wondering, I guess, how researchers can avoid this table 2 fallacy when interpreting covariate effects in multivariable regression models, at an ecological scale, like when both exposure and outcome are, aggregated across populations. And, variables that vary on context, may act as an effect modifier. Are you suggesting preference for stratified models over interaction terms or vice versa? Or are you more so advocating like more transparency in the extent to which that these, adjusted associations can be interpreted as, causal effects in any way?
Okay, so I listed 3 questions. So
Sorry.
no, it's okay. No, but just like to make sure I address everything. So the first one is about the table 2 fallacy. So, and about what it is and what can be done. The second one is really about what's the best approach to deal with effect modification, stratification versus interaction and others. And the last one is about transparency, if I understood correctly. So the first question about the table 2 fallacy, maybe I can just like summarize for the audience, just to make sure everybody is on the same page. So this is just a label that has been given to this practice that is that is quite problematic because of the wrong interpretation of this coefficient. So say you have the following etiological question. You're interested by neighborhood PM2.5 and asthma rate at the neighborhood level, if we stick to ecological design. Okay, so we have this kind of, for each zip code, for each census tract, you have a given level of PM2.5 and you have a given level of asthma rate. And you want to quantify the relationship between asthma, PM2.5 and asthma, and you want to just like use this relationship / correlation association to potentially infer that an increase in PM2.5 may lead to an increase in asthma rate. So to do that, we need to deal with different sources of biases and also statistical imprecision and other issues that we have to deal with by design and statistical tools. So one source of bias is confounding. And so there may be other variables, say, for example, the level of income that may act as a confounder, because we may have the variable income that is influencing the level of PM2.5 and also for other reasons than PM2.5 influencing the level of asthma. So this is why we're going to identify income as a confounder, and we would like to deal with it. And we have different analytical strategies to deal with confounders. Most common one is to use a multivariable regression model. So we're going to adjust, we're going to have the dependent variable being asthma, the first independent variable being PM2.5, and then we're going to adjust on incomes. That will be a way to isolate the role of PM2.5 from the influence of income. Okay, so when we do that, so we're going to use a statistical model, and we're going to get a coefficient for PM2.5 and a coefficient for income. The coefficient for PM2.5 is going to be a coefficient conditioned on the distribution of income, which means this is not the influence of PM2.5 on asthma. This is the influence of PM2.5 on asthma, removing the influence of income, which is what we want. But then if we look at the coefficient of income, we should just, the statistical software or model is going to give that information to us, but it's useless. We don't need this information. We need to include income in the model because of the coefficient for PM2.5, but we don't need anything else. But the coefficient for income is going to be the role, like the correlation between income and asthma, but removing one of the pathways through which income is going to influence asthma, which is PM2.5. So that could be interpreted as a control direct effect. And most of the time we don't necessarily care about specific coefficients. So the table 2 fallacy will be to report all of these coefficients and interpret them as if there were specific effect estimate for principal exposure, where it's not, because there is a structure and there is a lot of ambiguity in this coefficient. So the good practice is, if you have one exposure of interest like PM2.5, is to adjust and explain what you did and why you did it, but just to report this single coefficient that you care about. And do not report the other, and more importantly, do not interpret the other coefficients. So this is really what the table 2 fallacy is about. And that's very important because the literature is contaminated by all of these tables with useless information. And that is sometimes misleading because people are going to start interpreting coefficient for covariates, and they're not that easy to interpret. So that's really what table 2 fallacy is about. And what we recommend is just to do not show do not present, and more important, just to do not interpret coefficient for variables that are just used as variable to condition on as confounders. Okay, so then the second question about effect modification and how to actually do that. So effect modification is really about, we have an exposure, we have an outcome, and we have a third variable, and we want to try to understand how the relationship between this exposure and this specific health outcome is going to be different across the strata of a third variable. That could be race ethnicity, for example. And we have different techniques. We can do an interaction, which is fine. It's very efficient statistically because we have everything in the same model, and we're going to have an interaction term between exposure and like effect modifier of interest. And then we're going to use this interaction term and we're going to interpret it. Like the interpretability is a little bit different. It's a little bit tricky when we do an interaction term. And also another problem is really when it's on a multiplicative scale, it doesn't mean what most people think it means, because deviation from multiplicativity is not that intuitive. So this is just something I mentioned briefly about sometimes making an effort to assess effect modification on both additive and multiplicative scale could be a good idea. So you have both. You don't have to choose, and providing both is really a good practice. But it's, in general, having an interaction term is efficient statistically, but very difficult. It's not straightforward to interpret the result correctly in terms of just like what happens. The stratification is way better for interpretability because we really have one coefficient for one group, one coefficient for another group, for example, race ethnic group and another race ethnic group. And we just need to make sure that these two coefficients are distinguishable statistically speaking. This is why I highlighted that we really need to conduct a heterogeneity test, like a world test or Cochrane test, because we really need to make sure that these two coefficients are different. And if they are, then it will be extremely easy to say that this group is more vulnerable than the other, because the dose response is different. And when this group is exposed to the same pollution, the response in terms of a health outcome is going to be systematically higher. And that's to me the benefit of stratification. So it's not super efficient statistically because you really cut your sample in 2 or 3, but interpretability is better. So that's really the trade-off. Does that make sense, Andrew? There are also techniques in which it's kind of the best of both worlds, but it's just a little bit more technical, where you can use interaction terms and do some kind of post-estimation transformation to actually get some kind of estimate that will be easy to interpret. And that's the best of both worlds because you don't waste any statistical power and you don't lose any interpretability issue. And the last question was about transparency. I think it's a very important topic because we were able to identify a lot of issues thanks to the transparency of authors and that wrote this paper. So I think publishing the code, and now there are a lot of resources. For example, in my group, everything we publish, we systematically publish the code and a fake data set, a synthetic data set in GitHub. So that's for transparency, but also if somebody one day read the paper and thinks about something, like it would be way easier to identify the source of issue and a mistake and get back to us. So I think transparency, being transparent in terms of what we did, what we included and why, and publish and putting everything into appendix or into a GitHub page, I think is critical for research. So I could not support more transparency and reproducibility. So hopefully I addressed all of your questions, Andrew.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, if there's nothing else, thank you so much again, Dr. Benmarnia, sorry, excuse me. Benmarnia. Thank you so much. I know we learned a lot and got a lot of insight, and your presentation and answering all the questions were really helpful. And we really appreciate your time here, especially during this Friday afternoon.
That's okay. I hope everybody can enjoy their weekend. And yeah, if there is any follow-up questions also, we'll be happy to be in touch. And I don't know when the white paper will be published, but it will be published eventually, and we'll share the slides with everybody anyway. So hope it was somewhat helpful today, and that's just the beginning of many topics and discussions. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shaina. Thank you, Barbara, for organization. Thank you, May, as well, for the other, because there were 2 different contracts, so I was dealing with 2 different groups. So thank you to everybody for your coordination and everything.
Thank you. We appreciate this. This was very helpful.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.